Hi guys! Welcome back to another deep dive into the forgotten corners of history.
Tonight, we're descending into the shadows of the past, where stone walls hold secrets and darkness tells stories that daylight has never heard.
We're going inside a medieval dungeon, not just to explore its physical structure, but to understand the lives, the fears, the hopes, and the daily realities of those who found themselves within these cold, unforgiving spaces. This isn't a tale of heroes or villains, but rather a quiet examination of human endurance, architectural ingenuity, and the complex social systems that created these underground worlds. We'll walk through every corridor, examine every stone, and listen to every echo that still reverberates through these ancient chambers. From the moment a person first descended those worn stone steps to their final days within these walls, we'll experience it all together, slowly and methodically, because some stories deserve to be told with the weight and patience they've earned through centuries of silence. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there.
I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from.
Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The first thing you would notice if you were to step through the heavy wooden door that separated the dungeon from the world above would be the immediate change in temperature. The stone steps beneath your feet, worn smooth by countless footsteps over decades or even centuries, would feel solid and unforgiving through whatever footwear you might have. Each step downward would take you further from the warmth of the sun, further from the sounds of daily life above ground, and deeper into a world that existed in perpetual twilight. The air would grow thicker, heavy with moisture that seemed to cling to everything it touched. Your breath might become visible in small puffs, even during the warmer months, because stone has a way of holding on to cold that defies the seasons above. The transition from daylight to the dim illumination of the dungeon was perhaps one of the most disorienting aspects of descent into these underground chambers. Your eyes, accustomed to the bright world above, would struggle to adjust to the reduced light levels, and this adjustment period could last for several minutes, during which shapes remained indistinct and distances became difficult to judge. This temporary blindness was often used as a psychological tool, as new arrivals would find themselves stumbling and uncertain in an environment where their captors moved with practiced confidence. The human eye, remarkably adaptable under normal circumstances, would gradually learn to make the most of whatever light was available. But this adaptation came at a cost. Extended periods in low light could lead to lasting changes in vision and depth perception that would affect individuals long after their release from these subterranean chambers. The wooden door itself deserves detailed attention, as it represented far more than a simple barrier between two spaces. These doors were typically constructed from oak planks that had been aged and seasoned for years before being shaped and assembled by master carpenters who understood that their work might need to withstand decades of use under challenging conditions. The wood would be treated with various oils and resins that helped protect it from the moisture that was endemic in underground environments.
And the planks would be held together with hand-forged iron straps that were both functional and decorative.
The hinges, massive affairs of wrought iron, were designed to support the considerable weight of these doors while allowing them to swing smoothly despite the dampness that could cause lesser metalwork to rust and bind.
The sound of these doors closing was distinctive and memorable, a deep, resonant thud that seemed to echo through the stone corridors and announce to everyone within hearing distance that someone had just crossed the threshold between freedom and captivity. The walls on either side of these descending steps were typically constructed of large limestone or granite blocks, fitted together with remarkable precision despite the limited tools available to medieval masons. These weren't hastily built structures, but carefully planned architectural achievements that were designed to last for generations.
The mortar between the stones, made from lime, sand, and water, had often developed a patina over the years that gave it an almost organic appearance, as if the walls themselves were slowly transforming into something that belonged more to the earth than to human construction.
Running your hand along these walls, if you dared, you would feel not just the rough texture of stone, but also the subtle depressions and grooves left by previous occupants who had traced these same paths with their fingers, perhaps seeking comfort in the solid reality of the walls when everything else in their world had become uncertain. The selection and preparation of stone for dungeon construction was a process that could take months or even years to complete properly. Medieval masons understood that different types of stone had different properties that made them suitable for different purposes within the structure. The foundation stones, which would bear the greatest weight and face the most challenging conditions from groundwater and soil pressure, were typically chosen from the hardest and most durable materials available in the local area. These might be granite quarried from distant locations and transported at great expense, or local limestone that had been carefully selected.
The facing stones, which would be visible and accessible to occupants of the smooth, light-colored stones could create an atmosphere of clinical coldness, while rough, dark stones might convey a sense of ancient permanence that could be either comforting. The tools used by medieval stonemasons in dungeon construction were marvels of specialized engineering that had been developed and refined over centuries of experience. Chisels of different sizes and shapes allowed craftsmen to work stone with remarkable precision, creating smooth surfaces, intricate joints, and decorative elements that demonstrated both skill and artistry. Heavy wooden mallets, often bound with leather to reduce shock and improve grip, provided the controlled force necessary to shape hard stone without damaging the delicate cutting edges of the chisels. Measuring devices, including squares, levels, and plumb lines, ensured that walls were straight, floors were level, and ceiling arches were properly curved to distribute weight effectively. These tools were valuable possessions that master masons guarded carefully and passed down to their apprentices as part of a tradition that stretched back generations. The quarrying process that provided stone for dungeon construction was itself a major undertaking that involved entire communities and could reshape local landscapes. Quarries were typically located as close as possible to construction sites to minimize the enormous expense and difficulty of transporting heavy stone blocks over long distances using medieval technology.
Workers would spend weeks or months carefully removing overburden, the soil and loose rock that covered the valuable stone deposits, using hand tools and sometimes controlled fires to crack and break up resistant materials. The actual extraction of building stones required precise techniques that would split the rock along natural fracture lines while minimizing waste and avoiding damage to the blocks that would eventually form dungeon walls. Teams of workers using wedges, hammers, and levers would carefully separate individual blocks from the quarry face, then shape them roughly to size before the delicate work of final fitting and installation could begin. The lighting in a medieval dungeon was always sparse and carefully controlled. Torches were expensive and required constant maintenance, so they were used only when absolutely necessary. More often, you would find small oil lamps positioned at strategic intervals, their flames casting dancing shadows that made the corridors seem alive with movement. These shadows weren't just visual phenomena. They were psychological tools that played with the minds of those who spent extended periods in these spaces. The human eye, designed to interpret patterns and movement, would often see faces in the stone, figures in the shadows, and movement where there was none. This wasn't cruelty by design, but rather an inevitable consequence of the interplay between light, stone, and the human imagination when placed in prolonged isolation. The production and maintenance of illumination in medieval dungeons required a complex supply chain that connected these underground facilities to the broader medieval economy. Candles, when they were used, were typically made from tallow, the rendered fat of cattle or sheep, which was collected from butchers and processed in specialized workshops where the fat was melted down and repeatedly dipped over string wicks to build up layers of wax. The quality of these candles varied enormously depending on the purity of the tallow and the skill of the candle maker, with higher quality candles burning longer and producing less smoke and offensive odor. Oil lamps required a steady supply of various types of oil, including olive oil in regions where it was available, whale oil in coastal areas where whaling was practiced, and various vegetable oils extracted from local crops and plants. The wicks for these lamps were often made from twisted fibers of flax or hemp, materials that burned relatively cleanly and could be easily replaced when they became too short or clogged with carbon deposits. The strategic placement of lighting within a dungeon was a careful balance between practical necessity, security concerns, and economic constraints. Light sources needed to be positioned where they would provide maximum illumination for the corridors and work areas used by guards and staff, while also being secure from tampering or theft by prisoners who might use flames or lamp oil for escape attempts or other unauthorized purposes. The mounting systems for torches and lamps were typically made of wrought iron and designed to be both functional and tamper-resistant, with brackets that could hold the light sources securely while allowing for easy replacement when necessary. The spacing of light sources was calculated to provide overlapping pools of illumination that would eliminate dark corners where security threats might hide, while also minimizing the total number of flames that needed to be maintained and supplied with fuel. The psychological effects of artificial lighting in underground environments were profound and often underestimated by those who designed and operated medieval dungeons. The flickering, unsteady light produced by flames created an environment where shadows were constantly moving and changing, making it difficult to judge distances, recognize faces, or maintain spatial orientation over extended periods. This constant visual uncertainty could lead to a form of chronic stress that affected both physical and mental health, contributing to the overall challenge of maintaining psychological stability during extended periods of imprisonment. The warm, orange light produced by flames was also very different from natural sunlight, lacking many of the color frequencies that help regulate human circadian rhythms and maintain normal sleep patterns. Extended exposure to only artificial light could disrupt the body's natural clock, leading to sleep disorders, depression, and other health problems that compounded the already difficult circumstances of dungeon life. As you continued your descent, the architecture itself would begin to tell its story. Medieval dungeons were typically built beneath castles, fortified houses, or important civic buildings, taking advantage of the natural insulation provided by being underground and the security offered by multiple layers of stone and earth between the imprisoned and potential rescue. The ceiling above your head would likely be constructed in a barrel vault or groin vault style, architectural techniques that distributed the enormous weight of the structure above across the walls rather than relying on a single central support. This wasn't just practical engineering, it was beautiful in its own way, with the curved lines of the ceiling creating a sense of space that somehow made the confines feel both smaller and larger simultaneously. The mathematical precision required to construct these vaulted ceilings was remarkable, considering the limited computational tools available to medieval architects and builders. Each stone in the vault had to be cut to exact specifications that would allow it to fit perfectly with its neighbors, while maintaining the precise curve necessary to distribute structural loads effectively. The calculations involved in determining these specifications required a deep understanding of geometry, physics, and material science that medieval master builders developed through years of experience and apprenticeship. The margin for error in these calculations was extremely small, as even minor mistakes in the shape or placement of individual stones could lead to structural failures that might not become apparent until years after construction was completed. The tools used to achieve this mathematical precision were ingenious devices that demonstrated the sophisticated technical knowledge of medieval craftsmen. Wooden templates were carved to exact specifications and used to guide the cutting of individual stones, ensuring that each piece would fit properly in its designated position. Measuring devices, including wooden squares, plumb bobs, and string lines, allowed builders to verify that their work was proceeding according to plan and that the finished structure would meet the required specifications. Complex pulley systems and wooden frameworks provided the mechanical advantage necessary to lift and position heavy stones with the precision required for vault construction. The scaffolding systems used during dungeon construction were engineering marvels in their own right, requiring careful planning and substantial investment in materials and labor to create temporary structures that could support workers and materials while the permanent stone construction was completed. These scaffolding systems had to be strong enough to support the weight of workers, tools, and building materials, while also being flexible enough to be adjusted and modified as construction progressed.
The wooden beams, platforms, and bracing systems used in medieval scaffolding were typically constructed from specially selected timber that had been aged and seasoned to provide maximum strength and stability. The logistics of moving building materials within the confined spaces of dungeon construction sites presented unique challenges that required creative solutions and careful coordination. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds had to be maneuvered down narrow staircases, around tight corners, and into precise positions using only human and animal power, supplemented by simple mechanical devices. The planning required to coordinate these material movements with the work schedules of different craftsmen was complex, as delays in delivering materials to the right place at the right time could halt construction and waste valuable labor resources. The quality control systems used during medieval dungeon construction were based on the personal reputations and professional pride of individual craftsmen rather than formal inspection procedures, but they were nonetheless effective in ensuring that finished structures met high standards of workmanship and durability. Master craftsmen were responsible for training apprentices and supervising the work of journeymen, creating informal but effective systems for maintaining quality and consistency throughout large construction projects. The guild systems that regulated many medieval trades provided additional oversight and quality assurance by establishing standards for materials, techniques, and finished work that members were expected to meet. The seasonal constraints that affected medieval construction schedules had significant impacts on dungeon building projects, as certain types of work could only be performed during favorable weather conditions. Mortar work was particularly sensitive to temperature and humidity, as freezing temperatures could prevent proper curing and cause structural failures that might not become apparent until years later. Stone cutting and shaping could be performed year-round in covered workshops, but the transportation and installation of finished stones was often limited to dry weather, when roads and construction sites were accessible to heavy wagons and equipment. The sound in these spaces was unlike anything experienced in the world above. Every footstep would echo, but not in the sharp, immediate way you might expect. Instead, the sound would seem to roll along the walls, bouncing from stone to stone in a complex pattern that could make a single person's movement sound like several people walking in different directions. Conversations, even whispered ones, would carry much further than intended, creating an acoustic environment where privacy was nearly impossible, and where the simple act of speaking became a carefully considered decision. The stone walls absorbed some frequencies while amplifying others, creating an audio signature that was unique to each dungeon, and that became as familiar to long-term residents as their own heartbeat. The acoustic properties of medieval dungeons were influenced by a complex interplay of architectural factors, including the shape and size of chambers, the texture and composition of stone surfaces, the height and configuration of ceilings, and the presence of corridors, doorways, and other openings that could channel or redirect sound waves. The hard surfaces of stone walls, floors, and ceilings created highly reflective acoustic environments where sounds would bounce repeatedly before finally being absorbed or dissipated. This reverberation could create confusion about the direction and distance of sounds, making it difficult for occupants to accurately locate the sources of footsteps, voices, or other auditory cues that might provide important information about activities elsewhere in the facility.
The psychological impact of these unusual acoustic conditions was profound and often underestimated by those who designed and operated medieval dungeons. The constant presence of echoes and reflected sounds could create a sense of being surrounded by invisible presences, contributing to feelings of paranoia, anxiety, and disorientation that compounded the other stresses of confinement. The inability to judge distances and directions accurately based on sound cues could affect spatial orientation and contribute to the sense of confusion and helplessness that imprisonment was designed to create. Conversely, some occupants learned to use the acoustic properties of their environment to their advantage, developing techniques for communicating with other prisoners or gathering information about guard activities and routines. The variation in acoustic conditions between different areas of a dungeon could create distinct audio environments that serve different purposes within the overall facility design. The main corridors and common areas might be designed with acoustic properties that allowed guards to monitor activities and communications throughout the facility, while individual cells might be acoustically isolated to prevent coordination between prisoners. Interrogation rooms or administrative areas might have acoustic properties that enhanced the intimidating atmosphere of official proceedings, while guard quarters or work areas might be designed to provide acoustic comfort for staff members who spent extended periods in these underground environments. The use of sound as a tool for control and communication within medieval dungeons was both intentional and inadvertent, with acoustic design elements that supported security objectives while also creating unintended consequences that affected the daily experiences of occupants and staff. The echo and reverberation characteristics of stone corridors and chambers could be used to amplify the sounds of approaching guards, creating advanced warning systems that helped maintain security while also alerting prisoners to impending inspections or other activities. The acoustic isolation provided by thick stone walls could be used to prevent communication between prisoners, while also creating environments where interrogations or other sensitive activities could be conducted without being overheard by unauthorized persons. The development of acoustic signaling systems within medieval dungeons represented creative adaptations to the communication challenges created by confinement and architectural constraints. Prisoners developed elaborate tapping codes that used the sound-conducting properties of stone walls to transmit messages over considerable distances, creating communication networks that could span entire facilities despite the physical barriers designed to prevent such contact. Guards and staff members also developed acoustic signals, including whistle codes, bell systems, and verbal call and response procedures that allowed for efficient coordination of activities and rapid response to security threats or emergencies. The maintenance of acoustic conditions within medieval dungeons required ongoing attention to factors including the accumulation of debris, changes in humidity that could affect sound transmission, and structural modifications that might alter the acoustic properties of spaces. The buildup of straw, waste materials, or other organic matter could significantly dampen sound transmission and alter the reverberation characteristics of cells and corridors. Seasonal changes in humidity could affect both the transmission of sound through air
and the resonant properties of stone structures, creating variations in acoustic conditions that experienced occupants and staff learned to recognize and interpret. The documentation of acoustic phenomena in medieval dungeons was typically limited to incidental references in administrative records or personal accounts, but these scattered references provide intriguing glimpses into the audio environments of these underground facilities. Records sometimes mention the use of acoustic surveillance techniques, describe communication methods used by prisoners, or note the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to the unusual sound conditions found in underground stone structures. Modern acoustic analysis of preserved medieval dungeons has revealed sound transmission characteristics that help explain some of the behaviors and adaptations described in historical accounts. Water was a constant presence in medieval dungeons, though rarely in the controlled way we might expect from modern plumbing. Groundwater would seep through the mortar joints, creating slow but persistent streams that carved subtle channels in the stone floors over decades of patient erosion. This water wasn't necessarily clean or suitable for drinking, but it represented life and continuity in a place where both were often in short supply. The sound of dripping water became a metronome for the passage of time, a constant rhythm that marked minutes, hours, and days when other methods of timekeeping were unavailable. Some occupants learned to judge the time of day by the subtle changes in the pattern of these drips, as temperature variations above ground would slightly alter the rate at which moisture condensed and fell. The management of water in medieval dungeons was one of the most challenging aspects of their design and operation. While some water seepage was inevitable and even useful for basic needs, too much water could make the facility uninhabitable and compromise the structural integrity of the stone walls and foundations. Medieval engineers developed sophisticated drainage systems that channeled excess water away from living areas while preserving access to the water that was needed for drinking, cooking, and basic sanitation. These drainage systems typically consisted of carefully graded stone channels carved into the floors, with outlets that led to sumps, or connecting passages that carried the water to natural drainage areas outside the main structure. The construction of these drainage systems required precise calculation of water flow rates, understanding of local groundwater patterns, and careful attention to the seasonal variations that could dramatically affect the amount of water that needed to be managed. The quality of water available in medieval dungeons varied enormously depending on local geological conditions, the depth of the facility, and the proximity to natural water sources such as springs, wells, or underground streams. In some fortunate locations, dungeons were built near natural springs that provided clean, fresh water that was suitable for drinking and cooking. More commonly, the water that seeped through stone walls picked up minerals, sediments, and sometimes contaminants from the soil and rock it passed through, creating water that was discolored, foul-tasting, or potentially dangerous to consume. The medieval understanding of water quality was limited compared to modern scientific knowledge, but experienced dungeon operators often developed practical knowledge about which water sources were safe and which should be avoided. They might test water by observing its color, smell, and taste, or by watching how it affected animals or plants that came into contact with it.
The seasonal variations in water availability and quality added another layer of complexity to dungeon management that required careful planning and adaptation throughout the year. Spring snowmelt and heavy rains could dramatically increase the amount of water seeping through dungeon walls, sometimes to the point where cells became partially flooded and occupants had to be moved to higher, drier areas. Summer drought conditions might reduce water availability to dangerously low levels, requiring conservation measures and careful rationing of the water that was available. Winter freezing could disrupt drainage systems and create ice formations within the dungeon that blocked passages or damaged stone structures. These seasonal challenges meant that dungeon staff needed to be prepared for dramatic changes in conditions throughout the year, with supplies, equipment, and procedures that could adapt to these natural cycles. The storage and distribution of water within medieval dungeons required specialized containers and systems that could preserve water quality while making it available where it was needed. Large stone cisterns, carved from single blocks of stone or constructed from carefully fitted stone slabs, provided central storage for water that could be distributed to individual cells and work areas as needed. These cisterns were often covered to prevent contamination and evaporation, and they were designed with overflow systems that would prevent flooding during periods of high water availability. Smaller containers, including clay jugs, wooden buckets, and metal vessels, were used to transport water from storage areas to points of use. These containers required regular cleaning and maintenance to prevent the growth of algae, bacteria, and other contaminants that could make stored water unsafe for consumption. The individual cells within a medieval dungeon were marvels of efficient use of space, though comfort was never a primary consideration in their design. A typical cell might measure 8 feet by 6 feet, with a ceiling height of perhaps 7 feet, creating a space that was large enough for a person to lie down and stand up, but small enough to create a constant sense of enclosure. The floor was usually bare stone, sometimes covered with a thin layer of straw that was replaced irregularly and served as both bedding and insulation from the cold stone beneath. The walls of these cells often bore the marks of their occupants, scratched tallies marking days, carved names or symbols, and sometimes elaborate drawings that represented attempts to maintain sanity and hope in circumstances designed to erode both. The construction of individual cells required careful attention to both security and basic human needs, creating spaces that were secure enough to prevent escape, while still providing the minimum conditions necessary for survival over extended periods. The walls between cells were typically constructed with double thickness, creating a barrier that prevented communication between occupants, while also providing additional structural strength to support the weight of the building above. These walls often included complex internal structures with hidden passages or chambers that could be used by guards for surveillance or surprise access to cells when necessary. The thickness of the walls also provided acoustic insulation that prevented occupants from coordinating escape attempts or sharing information that might compromise security. The doors of individual cells were engineering marvels that balanced security, durability, and operational efficiency in ways that represented centuries of accumulated experience and refinement. Each door was essentially a miniature fortress, constructed from multiple layers of seasoned hardwood that were held together with hand-forged iron straps and reinforced with metal studs that prevented cutting or burning. The hinges were massive affairs, often weighing several pounds each, that were designed to support the considerable weight of these doors while allowing them to swing smoothly despite the dampness and temperature variations that could cause metal components to expand, contract, and bind. The locks themselves were works of art, precision mechanisms that incorporated multiple security features, including false keyways, hidden release mechanisms, and backup locking systems that would engage if the primary lock was tampered with. The small windows or openings that were sometimes included in cell doors served multiple purposes that went beyond simple observation and communication. These openings, typically no larger than a few inches square, were positioned at heights that allowed guards to observe occupants without exposing themselves to attack, while also providing occupants with a small psychological connection to the world outside their immediate confinement. The size and shape of these openings were carefully calculated to prevent the passage of weapons, tools, or other contraband, while still allowing for the delivery of food and the removal of waste. Some of these openings could be closed with sliding covers or hinged flaps that could be operated from the outside, providing guards with complete control over the occupants' access to light, air, and visual contact with the corridor beyond. The flooring within individual cells was typically constructed from the same stone materials used for the walls and ceilings, but the surface treatment of these floors varied depending on local customs, available resources, and the intended purpose of each cell. Some floors were left completely smooth, making them easier to clean, but also colder and more uncomfortable for occupants who had to sit, lie, and walk on them for extended periods. Other floors were deliberately roughened or textured to provide better grip for walking and to prevent slipping on wet surfaces, though this rougher texture could be uncomfortable for sitting or lying down. In some cases, floors included drainage channels or slightly raised sleeping areas that provided some protection from water accumulation during periods of heavy seepage or flooding. The ceiling construction in medieval dungeon cells represented some of the most sophisticated architectural techniques of the period, with curved stone vaults that distributed the enormous weight of the structure above across the walls, rather than relying on central support columns that would have reduced the usable space within each cell. These vaulted ceilings were not only functional, but also psychologically significant, creating a sense of enclosed space that could be either comforting or oppressive, depending on the occupant's mental state and circumstances. The construction of these vaults required master craftsmen who understood the complex geometry involved in creating curved stone surfaces that would remain stable under load for decades or centuries. The individual stones used in vault construction were often specially shaped to fit together in precise patterns, with each stone supporting its neighbors in a complex three-dimensional puzzle that became stronger as more stones were added. The door to each cell was typically made of heavy oak planks bound together with iron straps and secured with locks that were works of art in themselves. Medieval locksmiths took great pride in their craft, creating mechanisms that were both functional and decorative, with keys that were often carried as symbols of authority as much as practical tools. The lock wasn't just a barrier.
It was a statement about power, control, and the permanence of the situation for those on the wrong side of the door. The sound of these keys turning in their locks was distinctive and memorable, a metallic grinding that seemed to echo long after the actual sound had stopped, living on in the memory and imagination of those who heard it.
The craftsmanship involved in creating medieval dungeon locks represented some of the finest metalworking skills available during this historical period, with individual locks often taking weeks or months to complete and requiring the coordination of multiple specialized craftsmen. The lock bodies were typically forged from iron or steel using techniques that had been developed and refined over centuries of experience with metalworking. Each component of the lock mechanism had to be shaped and fitted with extreme precision to ensure reliable operation under the challenging conditions of high humidity, temperature variations, and potential tampering attempts that characterized the dungeon environment.
The key-making process was equally demanding, requiring the creation of metal implements that would operate smoothly and reliably, while also being difficult to duplicate or counterfeit by unauthorized persons.
Medieval keys were often large and elaborate, with complex patterns of teeth, grooves, and projections that corresponded to equally complex internal mechanisms within the locks themselves.
The metal used for key construction had to be hard enough to withstand repeated use and resist deformation, while also being workable enough to allow for the precise shaping required to match the lock mechanisms.
The heat treatment and finishing processes used on medieval keys were sophisticated techniques that balanced durability with functionality.
The security features incorporated into medieval dungeon locks went far beyond simple mechanical barriers, including hidden mechanisms, false keyways, and trap systems that could detect or prevent unauthorized access attempts. Some locks included multiple independent mechanisms that all had to be operated correctly and in the proper sequence to achieve successful unlocking. Others incorporated decoy elements that would appear to operate normally, but would actually trigger alarm systems or additional locking mechanisms if manipulated incorrectly. The most sophisticated locks included self-locking features that would automatically secure themselves if tampering was detected or if they were not operated according to proper procedures. The key management systems used in medieval dungeons were complex administrative procedures that balanced security requirements with operational efficiency, ensuring that authorized personnel had access to the areas they needed while preventing unauthorized duplication or misuse of keys.
Master key systems allowed senior staff members to access multiple areas with single keys, while individual area keys were distributed to guards and other personnel based on their specific responsibilities and security clearances.
Key inventory and control procedures tracked the location and use of all keys within the facility, with regular audits and inspections to ensure that security protocols were being followed properly.
The symbolic significance of keys and locks in medieval dungeons extended far beyond their practical functions, representing concepts of authority, control, and social hierarchy that were fundamental to medieval political and social systems.
The possession of keys was a visible symbol of power and responsibility that distinguished those who controlled access from those who were controlled by it. The elaborate decoration and ornamentation often found on medieval keys and locks served to reinforce these symbolic meanings, while also demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of the institutions that commissioned them.
The ceremonial presentation and transfer of keys marked important changes in authority and responsibility within dungeon hierarchies. The maintenance and repair of medieval dungeon locks required specialized knowledge and skills that were typically possessed only by the original craftsmen who created them, or by other equally skilled metalworkers who could understand and work with complex mechanical systems. Regular maintenance procedures included cleaning and lubrication of moving parts, adjustment of internal mechanisms to compensate for wear and environmental effects, and replacement of worn or damaged components. The oils and lubricants used for lock maintenance had to be specially formulated to provide long-lasting protection against corrosion and mechanical wear, while also being compatible with the metals and other materials used in lock construction. The evolution of lock technology during the medieval period reflected broader developments in metallurgy, mechanical engineering, and security practices that influenced many aspects of medieval life beyond dungeon operations. Innovations in lock design and construction often found applications in other areas, including residential security, commercial protection, and military fortification. The transfer of knowledge and techniques between different types of lock applications created a dynamic environment for technological development that contributed to ongoing improvements in security and reliability. The testing and quality assurance procedures used for medieval dungeon locks were typically based on practical trials and long-term performance evaluation rather than formal testing protocols, but they nonetheless provided effective methods for ensuring that finished locks would perform reliably under operational conditions. New locks were often subjected to extensive testing that simulated the environmental conditions and usage patterns they would encounter during actual service. The reputation of lockmakers depended heavily on the long-term reliability and security of their products, creating strong incentives for maintaining high-quality standards and continuous improvement of designs and manufacturing techniques. Ventilation in these underground spaces was a constant challenge that medieval architects addressed with varying degrees of success. Small shafts, barely wider than a person's arm, would sometimes connect the dungeon to the outside world, providing just enough air circulation to prevent the complete stagnation that would make the space uninhabitable. These shafts served multiple purposes. They allowed fresh air to enter, stale air to escape, and provided a psychological connection to the world above that was often more important than their practical function. Through these narrow openings, occupants could sometimes detect changes in weather, hear distant sounds of daily life, or catch glimpses of sky that reminded them that another world existed beyond their stone confines. The engineering challenges involved in creating effective ventilation systems for underground facilities were formidable, requiring careful analysis of airflow patterns, pressure differentials, and the complex interactions between temperature, humidity, and air movement in confined spaces. Medieval engineers had to work without the benefit of modern fluid dynamics theory or sophisticated measuring instruments, relying instead on practical experience, trial and error, and intuitive understanding of how air moves through different types of spaces. The design of ventilation shafts required precise calculations of diameter, length, and orientation to ensure adequate airflow while also maintaining security and structural integrity.
The construction of ventilation shafts presented unique technical challenges that required specialized tools, techniques, and expertise that were different from those used in other aspects of dungeon construction.
The excavation of narrow, deep shafts through solid rock or dense soil required specialized boring tools and removal techniques that could work effectively in extremely confined spaces. The lining and finishing of ventilation shafts had to provide smooth, durable surfaces that would minimize airflow resistance while also preventing structural collapse or water infiltration that could compromise the effectiveness of the ventilation system. The maintenance of ventilation systems was an ongoing challenge that required regular inspection and cleaning to prevent blockages that could reduce airflow or completely eliminate ventilation in affected areas. Debris, including leaves, animal nests, and accumulated dust and dirt, could gradually reduce the effectiveness of ventilation shafts, while ice formation during winter months could completely block airflow and create dangerous conditions for occupants. The cleaning and maintenance of ventilation systems often required specialized equipment and techniques that could work effectively in narrow, vertical shafts that were difficult or dangerous to access. The seasonal variations in ventilation effectiveness created changing conditions throughout the year that affected both the comfort and safety of dungeon occupants and the operational challenges faced by facility staff. During winter months, the temperature differential between indoor and outdoor air could create strong convection currents that provided excellent air circulation, but could also create uncomfortable drafts and rapid heat loss from living areas. Summer conditions with minimal temperature differences between inside and outside air could result in very poor air circulation that created stuffy, unhealthy conditions that were difficult to remedy without mechanical air movement systems. The integration of ventilation systems with other dungeon infrastructure required careful planning and coordination to ensure that air shafts did not compromise security, structural integrity, or other operational requirements. Ventilation openings had to be positioned and sized to prevent their use as escape routes, while still providing adequate airflow for the spaces they served. The routing of ventilation shafts through the structure had to avoid interference with plumbing, electrical systems, or other infrastructure while also maintaining the structural strength of walls and foundations. The natural ventilation principles used in medieval dungeon design were based on fundamental physics concepts, including convection, air pressure differentials, and the stack effect that drives air movement in vertical shafts. Medieval engineers understood these principles in practical terms, even though they lacked the theoretical framework that modern engineers use to analyze and predict airflow patterns. The application of these principles to dungeon ventilation design required careful consideration of factors, including the height and orientation of ventilation shafts, the size and placement of air intake and exhaust openings, and the internal layout of spaces that would affect air circulation patterns. The psychological impact of ventilation on dungeon occupants was often as important as its physical effects, with the movement of air and the sensory connection to the outside world providing important mental health benefits that helped maintain psychological stability during extended periods of confinement.
the ability to feel fresh air movement, detect changes in weather conditions, and occasionally catch scents or sounds from the outside world provided important psychological anchors that helped prevent the complete dissociation from reality that could result from total sensory isolation. Conversely, poor ventilation that created stuffy, stagnant air conditions could contribute to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems that compounded the challenges of imprisonment.
The measurement and monitoring of air quality in medieval dungeons was based on subjective assessment and practical observation rather than scientific instruments. But experienced facility operators developed reliable methods for detecting and addressing ventilation problems before they became serious health or safety hazards. The recognition of air quality problems typically relied on sensory cues, including odors, stuffiness, and the behavior of flames or other combustion sources that could indicate inadequate oxygen levels or the presence of harmful gases. The response to detected air quality problems might include opening additional ventilation passages, relocating occupants to better ventilated areas, or temporarily reducing the population density in affected spaces. The daily routine within a medieval dungeon was governed by necessity, security, and the limited resources available to maintain such a facility. Food, when it was provided, was typically delivered once per day, usually consisting of bread that was often stale, thin soup or gruel, and occasionally small portions of cheese or dried meat. The quality and quantity of food varied enormously depending on the status of the prisoner, the wealth of their captors, and the specific circumstances that had led to their imprisonment. Meals were served through small slots in the cell doors, interactions that represented the primary human contact many occupants would have during their time underground. These brief moments when food was passed through the slot became significant events, opportunities for communication, negotiation, or simply confirmation that the outside world still existed and remembered their presence. The preparation of food for dungeon occupants was a complex operation that required specialized facilities, trained staff, and careful management of limited resources. The kitchens that served medieval dungeons were typically located above ground, both for practical reasons related to ventilation and fire safety, and for security reasons that prevented occupants from accessing areas where knives, fires, and other potentially dangerous items were routinely used. The food prepared in these kitchens had to meet several challenging requirements. It needed to be nutritious enough to maintain the health of people who were getting limited exercise and exposure to sunlight. It had to be prepared in large quantities with consistent quality. It needed to remain safe and palatable during the time it took to transport it to individual cells. And it had to be prepared with ingredients that were available year-round and could be stored for extended periods without refrigeration. The transport of prepared food from kitchen to individual cells was itself a logistical challenge that required careful coordination and security procedures. Food typically had to be carried down stone stairs that could be slippery and poorly lit, through corridors that were narrow and sometimes crowded with staff members performing other duties, and finally delivered to individual cells, where the process of passing it through door slots required patience and care to avoid spills or contamination. The containers used for food transport were typically made of wood, clay, or metal, and they had to be designed to be easy to carry, easy to clean, and resistant to damage from repeated use in challenging conditions.
The staff members responsible for food delivery often developed specialized techniques and equipment that made their work more efficient and less physically demanding, including wheeled carts, specialized carrying tools, and standardized portions that simplified the distribution process. The timing of food delivery within medieval dungeons was carefully planned to support both the nutritional needs of occupants and the security requirements of the facility. Meals were typically delivered at consistent times each day, creating a routine that helped occupants maintain some sense of temporal structure in an environment where other time cues were limited or absent. The timing also had to coordinate with other dungeon activities, including guard shifts, maintenance work, and administrative procedures, to ensure that food delivery didn't interfere with security operations or create opportunities for problems. In some cases, the timing of meals was deliberately varied as a psychological tool, creating uncertainty and dependence that reinforced the power relationship between captors and captives. The nutritional content of food provided in medieval dungeons reflected the limited understanding of nutrition that existed during this historical period, as well as the economic and practical constraints that affected all aspects of dungeon operation.
The medieval diet typically emphasized grains, particularly bread made from wheat, barley, or oats, which provided calories and some protein while being relatively inexpensive and easy to store and prepare in large quantities.
Vegetables, when they were included, were usually limited to hardy varieties like onions, turnips, or cabbage that could be stored for extended periods without spoiling. Meat was expensive and perishable, so it was typically limited to special occasions or reserved for higher status prisoners who could afford better treatment. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in dungeon diets often led to nutritional deficiency diseases that could affect both physical health and mental functioning over time. The quality control systems for dungeon food were primitive by modern standards, but represented important efforts to prevent food poisoning and other health problems that could affect large numbers of people in close quarters. Kitchen staff were typically trained to recognize spoiled ingredients and to follow basic sanitation practices that reduced the risk of contamination during food preparation. Storage areas for food ingredients were designed to protect supplies from moisture, pests, and temperature variations that could cause spoilage. The containers and utensils used for food preparation were cleaned regularly, though the methods and materials available for cleaning were limited compared to modern sanitization techniques. Despite these precautions, foodborne illness was a constant concern in medieval dungeons, and outbreaks of stomach ailments or more serious diseases could quickly spread through the confined population. Personal hygiene in a medieval dungeon was a challenge that required creativity and adaptation. Water for washing was scarce and often had to serve multiple purposes. A small basin might be provided, but more often, occupants had to make do with whatever water they could collect from the persistent drips and seepage that characterized these underground spaces. Clothing was worn until it literally fell apart, and replacements were rare and precious commodities. The lack of adequate sanitation created health challenges that compounded the already difficult circumstances of imprisonment, leading to a gradual deterioration in physical condition that was often as much a part of the intended experience as the loss of freedom itself. The medieval understanding of hygiene and its relationship to health was fundamentally different from modern scientific knowledge,
But dungeon operators and occupants often developed practical approaches to cleanliness that helped prevent some of the worst consequences of poor sanitation. The concept of regular bathing was not well established in medieval culture generally, and in the confined environment of a dungeon, opportunities for full-body washing were extremely rare.
However, people did understand that certain basic hygiene practices could help prevent illness and discomfort, and they developed techniques for maintaining cleanliness using the limited resources available to them.
These techniques included spot cleaning of hands and faces using small amounts of water, regular removal and cleaning of clothing when possible, and attention to dental hygiene using crude tools like twigs or cloth to clean teeth and gums. The management of human waste in medieval dungeons was one of the most challenging and unpleasant aspects of operating these facilities, requiring systems and procedures that balanced sanitation needs with security concerns and practical limitations. The most basic approach was the provision of simple chamber pots, or waste buckets, that could be emptied periodically, but these containers created problems, including odor, attracting pests, and the risk of spills or contamination. More sophisticated dungeons included primitive toilet facilities that connected to drainage systems or waste removal channels, though these systems required careful maintenance to prevent blockages and backups that could create unsanitary conditions throughout the facility. The staff responsible for waste removal faced considerable health risks from exposure to human waste, and this work was typically assigned to the lowest-ranking members of the dungeon hierarchy. The laundry facilities and procedures available in medieval dungeons were extremely limited, reflecting both the scarcity of clean water and the practical difficulties of washing, drying, and maintaining clothing in underground environments. When clothing could be washed, the process typically involved soaking items in whatever clean water was available, scrubbing them with simple soap made from animal fat and ash, and hanging them to dry in areas where air circulation might help remove moisture. However, the high humidity and limited air movement in most dungeons meant that clothing rarely dried completely, leading to problems with mildew, odors, and fabric deterioration that made garments uncomfortable and unhealthy to wear. Many occupants learned to work with partially damp clothing as a normal condition, developing techniques for managing the discomfort and health risks associated with wet or damp fabric for extended periods. The provision of basic hygiene supplies in medieval dungeons was typically minimal and might depend on the status of the occupant, the policies of the facility, and the availability of resources at any given time. Soap, when it was available, was usually of the crudest variety, made from animal fats and wood ash, using techniques that produced a harsh, caustic product that could irritate skin and eyes while providing some cleaning action. Combs and other grooming tools were rare and valuable items that might be shared among multiple occupants, or provided only to those who could afford to pay for them. Tooth cleaning materials were virtually unknown, though some people improvised dental hygiene tools using twigs, cloth strips, or other available materials. The lack of mirrors meant that people had limited ability to assess their own appearance or identify hygiene problems that might need attention. The health consequences of poor hygiene in medieval dungeons were serious and often progressive, affecting both physical health and psychological well-being in ways that could have lasting impact even after release from imprisonment.
Skin conditions, including rashes, infections, and parasitic infestations, were common problems that could become serious medical emergencies in environments where treatment options were limited.
Dental problems, including tooth decay and gum disease, were virtually inevitable given the lack of proper dental care and the poor nutritional quality of typical dungeon food.
Eye infections, respiratory problems, and other ailments related to poor sanitation could develop gradually and become chronic conditions that affected quality of life and overall health. The psychological impact of being unable to maintain personal cleanliness could also be significant, affecting self-esteem, social relationships, and mental health in ways that compounded the other challenges of dungeon life. The psychology of life in a medieval dungeon was perhaps more complex than the physical challenges, though the two were inextricably linked. The human mind, deprived of normal stimulation and social interaction, would often create elaborate internal worlds to compensate for the stark reality of stone walls and iron bars. Some occupants would spend hours each day in detailed mental reconstructions of places they had known, people they had loved, or experiences they had treasured before their imprisonment. These internal journeys weren't just escapism. They were active efforts to maintain psychological health and preserve identity in circumstances designed to strip away everything that made a person unique and individual. The development of coping mechanisms for psychological survival in medieval dungeons represented remarkable demonstrations of human adaptability and resilience in the face of extreme adversity. Occupants developed personal routines and rituals that provided structure and meaning to days that might otherwise blend together in an undifferentiated stream of monotony and despair. These routines might include physical exercises performed within the limited space of individual cells, mental exercises designed to maintain cognitive function and memory, creative activities that used whatever materials were available, and spiritual practices that provided connection to larger purposes and meanings beyond immediate circumstances. The impact of sensory deprivation on medieval dungeon occupants was profound and progressive, affecting perception, memory, and cognitive function in ways that could have lasting consequences even after release from confinement. The limited visual stimulation provided by stone walls, dim lighting, and restricted views could lead to changes in visual processing and perception that made it difficult to judge distances, recognize faces, or interpret complex visual scenes. The reduction in auditory stimulation, except for the echoing sounds characteristic of stone chambers, could affect hearing sensitivity and the ability to process normal conversations and environmental sounds. The social isolation experienced by many medieval dungeon occupants created psychological challenges that were often more difficult to endure than the physical hardships of confinement. Humans are fundamentally social creatures who depend on interaction with others for psychological well-being, identity formation, and emotional stability. The removal of normal social contact could lead to a gradual deterioration in social skills, emotional regulation, and the ability to maintain relationships with other people. Some occupants developed elaborate imaginary relationships with fictional companions, or maintained detailed mental conversations with absent friends and family members as ways of preserving their social and emotional capabilities. The impact of uncertainty
and lack of control on the psychological well-being of medieval dungeon occupants was perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of their experience.
Not knowing how long their confinement would last, what would happen to them in the future, or whether their situation might improve or worsen, created chronic stress that could affect both mental and physical health. The complete lack of control over basic aspects of daily life, including when to eat, sleep, or interact with other people, created feelings of helplessness and dependency that could undermine self-confidence and personal agency in ways that persisted long after release from confinement. The role of memory and imagination in maintaining psychological stability during medieval dungeon confinement was crucial for many occupants who learned to use their mental capabilities as resources for survival and adaptation. The deliberate cultivation of positive memories and the systematic mental rehearsal of pleasant experiences could provide temporary relief from immediate hardships, while also maintaining connections to identity and values that transcended current circumstances. The creative use of imagination to envision possible futures, plan for eventual release, or simply create mental entertainment could help maintain cognitive function and emotional stability during extended periods of confinement. The spiritual and religious dimensions of psychological survival in medieval dungeons were particularly important, given the central role of religion in medieval culture, and the comfort that spiritual beliefs could provide during times of extreme adversity. Many occupants found that their religious faith provided frameworks for understanding and accepting their suffering, while also offering hope for eventual redemption or reward in an afterlife that would compensate for present hardships. Prayer, meditation, and other spiritual practices could provide structure for daily routines, while also offering psychological benefits, including stress reduction, emotional regulation, and connection to transcendent purposes and meanings. The development of mental exercises and intellectual activities by medieval dungeon occupants demonstrated remarkable creativity and determination in the face of severe limitations on available resources and stimulation. Some occupants would mentally compose poetry, stories, or songs that helped them process their experiences while also providing entertainment and intellectual stimulation. Others would engage in complex mathematical calculations, philosophical reflections, or theological discussions with themselves that helped maintain cognitive function and provided a sense of intellectual accomplishment and growth. The preservation of personal identity and sense of self during medieval dungeon confinement required conscious effort and deliberate strategies that helped maintain connections to pre-confinement life, relationships, and values that defined individual identity. This might involve the systematic mental rehearsal of personal history and important life events, the maintenance of personal grooming and appearance to whatever extent possible, and the cultivation of personal values and beliefs that provided continuity between past, present, and hoped-for future circumstances. The ability to maintain a coherent sense of personal identity despite extreme external pressures was often crucial for psychological survival and eventual successful readjustment to life outside confinement. Sleep in these underground chambers was rarely restful or complete. The hard stone floors, even when covered with straw, provided little comfort for bodies accustomed to proper beds. The constant dampness meant that clothing and bedding never fully dried, creating a persistent chill that seemed to penetrate to the bones.
More significantly, the altered relationship with natural light cycles disrupted the normal patterns of sleep and wakefulness that regulate human physiology. Without the cues provided by sunrise and sunset, many occupants found their sleep patterns becoming irregular and fragmented, leading to a dreamlike quality of consciousness that blurred the boundaries between sleeping and waking hours. The physiological impact of disrupted sleep patterns on medieval dungeon occupants created cascading health problems that affected both physical and mental well-being in ways that compounded the other stresses of confinement. The human circadian rhythm, which regulates not only sleep and wakefulness, but also hormone production, body temperature, and many other biological processes, depends heavily on exposure to natural light cycles to maintain proper synchronization. The absence of these natural cues in underground environments could lead to circadian rhythm disorders that affected sleep quality, mood regulation, cognitive function, and immune system performance. The sleeping accommodations provided in medieval dungeons varied widely depending on the status of occupants, the resources available to facility operators, and the specific policies governing treatment of different categories of prisoners. The most basic sleeping arrangements consisted of nothing more than bare stone floors that provided no comfort or insulation from the cold, damp conditions that characterized these underground spaces. Slightly better accommodations might include thin layers of straw that provided minimal cushioning and insulation, while also creating problems with vermin, odors, and fire hazards that required constant management and replacement. The bedding materials available in medieval dungeons were typically limited to whatever organic materials could be obtained locally at reasonable cost and that could withstand the challenging environmental conditions of high humidity, temperature variation, and potential contamination from various sources. Straw was the most common bedding material because it was relatively inexpensive, provided some insulation and cushioning, and could be replaced regularly when it became too soiled or infested with pests. Hay was sometimes used as an alternative to straw, offering similar properties, but often at higher cost and with different characteristics in terms of durability and pest resistance. The management of bedding in medieval dungeons required careful attention to hygiene, pest control, and fire safety concerns that could create serious problems if not properly addressed. Organic bedding materials created ideal breeding environments for fleas, lice, and other parasites that could rapidly spread throughout confined populations and create significant health problems. The same materials that provided comfort and insulation were also highly flammable and could create serious fire hazards in environments where open flames were used for lighting and heating. Regular replacement of bedding materials was necessary to prevent the accumulation of waste, odors, and contaminants that could create unsanitary conditions. The temperature regulation challenges faced by medieval dungeon occupants during sleep were particularly severe due to the combination of cold stone surfaces, high humidity, and limited bedding and clothing that provided inadequate insulation from environmental conditions. The thermal mass of stone walls and floors absorbed body heat rapidly, creating conditions where it was difficult to maintain adequate body temperature even when covered with whatever bedding was available. The high humidity characteristic of underground spaces reduced the effectiveness of clothing and bedding as insulation, while also creating conditions that felt colder than the actual air temperature.
The noise environment in medieval dungeons during nighttime hours created additional challenges for achieving restful sleep, with sounds including dripping water, movement of other occupants, guard activities, and various environmental noises that could make it difficult to fall asleep or stay asleep throughout the night.
The acoustic properties of stone chambers meant that sounds could travel long distances and be amplified or distorted in ways that made it difficult to identify their sources or judge their significance. The irregular and unpredictable nature of many dungeon sounds meant that occupants could never fully relax and might remain in a state of partial alertness that prevented deep, restorative sleep. The sleep disorders that commonly developed among medieval dungeon occupants included insomnia, fragmented sleep patterns, and various forms of sleep disruption that could have serious consequences for physical health, mental stability, and cognitive function.
Insomnia could be caused by physical discomfort, environmental conditions, psychological stress, or the disruption of natural circadian rhythms that regulated sleep and wakefulness.
Fragmented sleep patterns, where individuals would wake frequently throughout the night and have difficulty returning to sleep, could prevent the deep sleep stages that are necessary for physical recovery and mental health. The dream experiences reported by medieval dungeon occupants often reflected the psychological stresses and adaptive challenges of their confinement, with dreams that might include escape fantasies, memories of life before imprisonment, anxiety dreams about threats and dangers, or bizarre and disturbing imagery that reflected the unusual sensory environment and social isolation of dungeon life. The interpretation and significance of dreams was often important to medieval people, who might see dreams as divine messages, prophetic visions, or meaningful communications from spiritual realms. The unusual and often intense dreams experienced during dungeon confinement could provide comfort, guidance, or entertainment, but they could also create additional psychological stress if they were interpreted as omens of doom or evidence of spiritual corruption. The adaptation strategies that medieval dungeon occupants developed for coping with sleep challenges demonstrated remarkable creativity and determination in the face of severe environmental and resource limitations. Some individuals learned to sleep in short periods throughout the day and night, adapting their sleep patterns to the irregular schedules and unpredictable conditions of dungeon life. Others developed personal routines and rituals that helped prepare their minds and bodies for sleep despite the challenging conditions, including relaxation techniques, mental exercises, or spiritual practices that could help induce sleep and improve sleep quality. The changing seasons above ground were felt in subtle but meaningful ways within the dungeon environment. Winter would bring increased dampness and cold that seemed to seep through even the thickest stone walls, making the already challenging living conditions even more difficult. Summer heat, while rarely felt directly, would sometimes create changes in air pressure and humidity that affected the comfort level within the cells. Spring rains would often increase the flow of water through the stone walls, sometimes to the point where cells would become partially flooded, forcing occupants to find creative ways to stay dry and warm. These seasonal changes provided a natural calendar that helped mark the passage of time in a place where days could otherwise blend together into an undifferentiated stream of existence. The social dynamics within a medieval dungeon, when multiple people were held in the same facility, were fascinating studies in human adaptation and survival.
Communication between cells was possible through whispered conversations that carried along the stone walls, tapping codes that were developed and refined over time, and sometimes through brief contacts during the rare occasions when cell doors were opened simultaneously.
These interactions created informal hierarchies and support systems that could mean the difference between maintaining hope and descending into despair. Information became a valuable currency. News from the outside world, knowledge about the intentions of their captors, or simply stories and memories that could provide entertainment and distraction during the long hours of isolation. The staff who worked in medieval dungeons were often as trapped by the circumstances as those they guarded, though in different ways. Guards, turnkeys, and other personnel were typically drawn from the lower social classes and found themselves in positions that required them to balance humanity with duty, compassion with security, and personal survival with moral responsibility. Many of these workers developed their own coping mechanisms for the psychological challenges of their jobs, creating routines and rituals that helped them maintain their own mental health while performing tasks that could be emotionally and spiritually demanding. The relationship between guards and prisoners was often more complex than simple antagonism, with mutual dependencies and even friendships sometimes developing over extended periods of shared existence in these underground worlds. The recruitment and training of dungeon staff was a complex process that required finding people who possessed the right combination of physical capability, emotional stability, trustworthiness, and willingness to work in challenging conditions for relatively low wages. Physical strength was essential for managing heavy doors, transporting supplies, and dealing with potential security threats. But equally important was the mental fortitude necessary to work in an environment that could be psychologically demanding and emotionally draining. Trustworthiness was crucial because dungeon staff had access to keys, weapons, and information that could compromise security if they were corrupted or coerced by prisoners or outside agents. The willingness to work underground in conditions that were often uncomfortable, unhealthy, and socially stigmatized meant that recruitment often had to focus on people who had limited other employment options. The daily routines and responsibilities of dungeon staff were carefully structured to maintain security while ensuring that all necessary tasks were completed efficiently and safely. Guard shifts were typically arranged to provide continuous coverage throughout the day and night, with overlapping periods that allowed for information exchange and coordination between shift changes. The keys and other security equipment were carefully controlled through formal procedures that required multiple people to be involved in any access to high security areas or valuable materials. Regular inspections of cells, corridors, and security equipment were conducted to identify potential problems before they could develop into serious security threats or safety hazards. The specialized roles within dungeon operations reflected the complexity of maintaining these underground facilities and the variety of skills required to keep them functioning effectively. The head turnkey or dungeon keeper was typically an experienced professional who understood all aspects of the operation and served as the primary liaison between the dungeon and the outside authorities who controlled its operation. Individual guards were responsible for specific areas or shifts, with duties that included monitoring prisoners, delivering food, conducting searches, and maintaining security equipment.
Maintenance staff were responsible for the physical upkeep of the facility, including stone repair, drainage system maintenance, and the care of locks, keys, and other mechanical systems.
Kitchen staff, when they were part of the dungeon operation, were responsible for food preparation and delivery, requiring skills in cooking, food preservation, and logistics. The compensation and working conditions for dungeon staff varied widely depending on the location, the importance of the facility, and the resources available to the authorities who controlled the operation. Wages were typically modest, reflecting the fact that these were working-class positions that required little formal education or specialized training beyond what could be learned on the job. However, the challenging nature of the work and the importance of maintaining loyalty and reliability among staff meant that compensation often included additional benefits, such as housing, food allowances, or job security that might not be available in other forms of employment.
Some positions also offered opportunities for advancement within the dungeon hierarchy or transfer to other government positions that could provide better long-term career prospects.
The social status of dungeon workers within medieval society was generally low, as these jobs were associated with unpleasant and morally ambiguous work that respectable people preferred to avoid.
This social stigma could affect not only the workers themselves, but also their families, making it difficult to marry into higher social classes or to provide their children with opportunities for social advancement.
However, the steady employment and government connection associated with dungeon work could also provide a form of security and stability that was valuable during periods of economic uncertainty or political upheaval.
Some dungeon workers took pride in their professional competence and developed strong loyalties to their institutions and colleagues that helped compensate for the negative aspects of their social position. The health and safety risks faced by dungeon staff were significant and often underestimated by the authorities who employed them. Exposure to dampness, poor air quality, and unsanitary conditions could lead to respiratory problems, skin conditions, and other health issues that were occupational hazards of working in underground environments. The risk of injury from dealing with potentially violent or desperate prisoners was always present, and the limited medical care available during the medieval period meant that injuries could easily become serious or permanent disabilities. The psychological stress of working in an environment associated with suffering and confinement could also take a toll on mental health, leading to problems that were not well understood or addressed by medieval society. The economic aspects of maintaining a medieval dungeon were significant and often influenced the conditions experienced by those held within them. Every aspect of the operation required financial resources: the initial construction, ongoing maintenance of the stone structures, payment of staff, provision of food and basic necessities, and replacement of equipment and supplies. These costs had to be balanced against the purposes the dungeon was intended to serve, whether that was punishment, deterrence, political control, or economic advantage through ransom or forced labor. The financial pressures often meant that conditions were maintained at the minimum level necessary to achieve the desired objectives, with little consideration for comfort or humanity beyond what was required to keep occupants alive and functional. The financing of medieval dungeon construction typically involved substantial initial investments that could strain the resources of even wealthy nobles or municipal governments. The cost of quarrying and transporting stone, hiring skilled masons and other craftsmen, and purchasing the specialized tools and materials needed for construction could easily exceed the annual income of a moderate-sized estate or town.
These costs had to be justified in terms of the strategic, political, or economic benefits that the dungeon was expected to provide over many years of operation.
In some cases, the construction costs were spread over extended periods, with dungeons being built in phases as resources became available and as the need for additional capacity developed. The ongoing operational expenses of medieval dungeons included a wide variety of costs that had to be carefully managed to maintain financial sustainability while achieving the facility's objectives. Staff wages, while individually modest, could represent a significant expense when multiplied by the number of people required to maintain security and operations around the clock throughout the year. Food costs varied depending on the number of occupants, the quality of food provided, and the local availability and pricing of basic foodstuffs. Maintenance expenses were often unpredictable, but could be substantial when major repairs were needed to stone structures, drainage systems, or security equipment. The costs of fuel for lighting and heating, while typically modest compared to other expenses, were nonetheless necessary for basic operations and safety. The revenue sources that supported dungeon operations were diverse and often reflected the complex political and economic relationships of medieval society. Some dungeons were financed directly by the nobles or governmental authorities who controlled them, using tax revenue or income from their estates to cover operational costs. Others generated income through fees charged to families of prisoners, ransom payments from wealthy captives, or the sale of goods produced by forced labor within the facility. In some cases, dungeons were operated as part of larger administrative systems that included courts, tax collection, and other governmental functions, with costs and revenues shared across multiple activities. The economic impact of dungeons on local communities was often significant, both in terms of employment opportunities and the demand for goods and services needed to support dungeon operations. Local farmers might find markets for their grain, vegetables, and livestock in supplying food for dungeon occupants and staff. Craftsmen, including blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons, could find steady work maintaining and improving dungeon facilities. Merchants might develop specialized businesses supplying candles, oil, rope, and other materials needed for dungeon operations. However, dungeons could also have negative economic impacts on communities, particularly if they were associated with political instability or if their operations interfered with normal trade and commerce. The cost-benefit analysis of medieval dungeon operations was typically informal and based more on political and social considerations than on detailed financial calculations. The deterrent effect of having a visible and well-known dungeon facility was considered valuable, even if it was difficult to quantify in economic terms. The ability to control political opponents through imprisonment was often seen as essential to maintaining power and stability, regardless of the financial costs involved. The revenue generated through ransom payments could sometimes provide substantial returns on investment, particularly when high-value captives could be held for extended periods while negotiations were conducted. The economic efficiency of different dungeon designs and operational approaches varied considerably, with some facilities proving to be more cost-effective than others in achieving their intended purposes. Larger dungeons could often achieve economies of scale in staffing, food preparation, and facility maintenance. But they also required greater initial investments and more complex management systems. Smaller facilities might be less efficient in some ways, but could be more responsive to changing needs and more easily modified or expanded as circumstances required. The location of dungeons also affected their economics, with facilities built in areas where construction materials and labor were readily available, typically costing less to build and maintain than those in remote or difficult locations. Legal proceedings and documentation related to medieval dungeons were often elaborate affairs that reflected the complex social and political structures of the time. Records had to be maintained regarding who was held, why they were imprisoned, what conditions had been imposed, and what procedures were being followed for their eventual release or other resolution of their cases. These documents, many of which have survived to the present day, provide fascinating insights into the legal thinking and social attitudes of medieval societies. They also reveal that imprisonment in a dungeon was often part of a larger legal process rather than a final punishment, with many occupants eventually being released, ransomed, or transferred to other facilities, depending on changing political or economic circumstances. The record-keeping systems used in medieval dungeons were surprisingly sophisticated, reflecting the importance placed on proper documentation and legal accountability, even in institutions that we might think of as operating outside normal legal frameworks. Each prisoner typically had a file that included information about their identity, the charges or circumstances that led to their imprisonment, any special conditions or restrictions that applied to their case, and records of significant events during their confinement. These records were usually maintained by educated staff members, often clergy or other literate individuals who could read and write in Latin or the local vernacular languages used for official business. The legal frameworks that governed medieval dungeon operations were complex combinations of customary law, royal or noble prerogatives, church law, and local regulations that varied significantly from one location and time period to another. In some cases, imprisonment in a dungeon was a form of punishment that had been formally imposed by a court following a trial or legal proceeding. In other cases, detention might be administrative or preventive, designed to hold suspects while investigations were conducted or to prevent individuals from interfering with political or military activities. The legal status of prisoners could change during their confinement as new evidence was discovered, political circumstances shifted, or negotiations were completed. The appeals and review processes available to dungeon prisoners were limited but not entirely absent, reflecting medieval concepts of justice and due process that were different from modern legal systems, but nonetheless provided some protections against arbitrary or indefinite detention. Prisoners or their representatives could sometimes petition for release based on new evidence, changed circumstances, or procedural irregularities in their original detention. Religious authorities might intervene on behalf of prisoners, particularly in cases where church law or sanctuary rights were involved. Family members or political allies could sometimes negotiate for improved conditions or release through payment of fines, provision of hostages, or other arrangements that satisfied the concerns of those who controlled the dungeon.
The integration of dungeon operations with broader legal and administrative systems required coordination between different authorities and institutions that could sometimes lead to conflicts or confusion about jurisdiction and responsibility. Local nobles might control dungeons within their territories, but they might also be subject to oversight from royal officials, church authorities, or other powerful institutions that had their own interests in particular cases or legal principles. The resolution of these jurisdictional issues often required negotiation and compromise that could affect the treatment of individual prisoners and the general policies governing dungeon operations. The documentation of prisoner releases, transfers, and other case resolutions was an important aspect of dungeon record-keeping that served both legal and administrative purposes. These records provided evidence that proper procedures had been followed, and that the authorities involved had met their legal obligations regarding the treatment and disposition of prisoners. They also provided information that could be useful for future legal proceedings or administrative decisions involving the same individuals or similar circumstances. The survival of these historical records has provided modern scholars with valuable insights into medieval legal systems and social structures that might otherwise be poorly understood. The role of legal advocates and representatives in medieval dungeon cases was limited compared to modern legal systems, but trained legal professionals did sometimes become involved in complex or high-profile cases. These might include clerks or scribes who could prepare legal documents, clergy who understood church law and could provide spiritual counsel, or secular lawyers who specialized in particular types of legal problems. The availability of legal assistance often depended on the social status and financial resources of the prisoner or their family, creating disparities in treatment that reflected the broader inequalities of medieval society. The religious aspects of life in medieval dungeons cannot be overlooked, as faith played a central role in the worldview of most people during this historical period. Many dungeons included small chapels or prayer areas where occupants could maintain their spiritual practices, and visits from religious officials were often permitted or even encouraged. These spiritual resources provided not just comfort, but also intellectual stimulation and social connection that could be crucial for maintaining mental health during extended periods of isolation. Prayer, meditation, and religious study became important ways of structuring time and finding meaning in circumstances that might otherwise seem meaningless and hopeless. The architectural evolution of medieval dungeons reflects changing attitudes toward imprisonment, punishment, and social control over the centuries. Early dungeons were often crude affairs, little more than natural caves or hastily excavated underground chambers secured with basic doors and locks. As the medieval period progressed, dungeon design became more sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from years of operation and reflecting advances in construction techniques and security technologies. Later dungeons featured improved ventilation systems, better drainage, more efficient layouts, and sometimes even primitive amenities that acknowledged the humanity of their occupants while still serving their primary functions as places of detention. The influence of military engineering on dungeon design became increasingly apparent during the later medieval period, as builders began to apply lessons learned from castle fortification and siege warfare to the construction of underground detention facilities. The principles of defense in depth, Multiple security barriers and redundant systems that were essential for military architecture were adapted to create dungeons that were increasingly difficult to escape from and increasingly resistant to rescue attempts from outside forces. These military-influenced designs often included features such as multiple levels of security, hidden passages for guards, and defensive positions that could be used to repel attacks on the facility. The regional variations in dungeon architecture reflected local building traditions, available materials, and cultural attitudes toward imprisonment and punishment that varied significantly across different parts of medieval Europe. In areas where stone was readily available and skilled masons were common, dungeons might feature elaborate carved decorations, precisely fitted stonework, and architectural details that demonstrated the wealth and power of their builders. In regions where wood was more abundant than stone, dungeon construction might incorporate timber framing, wooden floors, and other elements that created different acoustic and environmental conditions. The climate of different regions also influenced design choices, with dungeons in colder areas requiring different approaches to heating and insulation than those in warmer climates. The integration of dungeons with other architectural elements reflected the multi-purpose nature of many medieval buildings and the need to efficiently use expensive construction resources. Dungeons built beneath castles often shared structural elements with the defensive works above ground, with foundation walls and support systems that served both purposes simultaneously. Administrative dungeons built beneath town halls or other civic buildings might incorporate features that allowed them to serve multiple functions, including storage, workshops, or meeting spaces during periods when they were not needed for detention. Religious institutions that operated dungeons sometimes designed them to include chapels, libraries, or other spaces that reflected their spiritual mission alongside their secular responsibilities. The symbolic and psychological aspects of dungeon architecture were often as important as their practical functions, with design elements chosen specifically to convey messages about power, authority, and the consequences of challenging established order. The imposing stone facades, heavy iron doors, and forbidding entrance passages were designed to intimidate visitors and create an atmosphere of fear and respect that would discourage potential troublemakers. The internal layouts were often deliberately confusing and disorienting, with corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, stairs that ended in blank walls, and passages that doubled back on themselves in ways that would make navigation difficult for anyone unfamiliar with the facility. The technological innovations that influenced dungeon construction included advances in metallurgy that allowed for stronger and more sophisticated locking mechanisms, improvements in stone-cutting techniques that permitted more precise construction, and developments in engineering that enabled the creation of more complex structural systems. The introduction of new tools and construction methods often led to the modification or reconstruction of existing dungeons to take advantage of improved security or operational efficiency. These technological changes also influenced the training and specialization of craftsmen involved in dungeon construction, leading to the development of expertise that was specifically focused on the unique requirements of underground detention facilities. The preservation and modification of medieval dungeons over time reflects the changing needs and priorities of the societies that used them, as well as the practical challenges of maintaining complex stone structures over periods of centuries.
Many dungeons were expanded or modified multiple times during their periods of active use, with new cells, improved facilities, and updated security systems added as needs changed and resources became available. Some dungeons were converted to other uses when they were no longer needed for detention, becoming storage areas, workshops, or even residential spaces that took advantage of their solid construction and underground location. The daily maintenance required to keep a medieval dungeon operational was extensive and constant. Stone walls had to be inspected regularly for signs of deterioration or damage that could compromise security. Locks and keys required ongoing maintenance to ensure they continued to function properly. Drainage systems had to be cleared of debris to prevent flooding. Ventilation shafts needed to be kept open and free of obstructions. Food storage areas had to be maintained to prevent spoilage and pest infestation. These maintenance tasks provided employment for skilled craftsmen and laborers, creating a small economy centered around the dungeon that connected it to the broader community in ways that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. The escape attempts from medieval dungeons were rare but not unknown, and they often revealed remarkable ingenuity and determination on the part of those who undertook them. The challenges involved in escaping from an underground stone facility were enormous. Heavy doors, complex locks, thick walls, limited tools, and constant surveillance all combined to make successful escape extremely difficult. However, some attempts did succeed, often through careful planning, patient work over extended periods, and sometimes cooperation between multiple prisoners or with sympathetic staff members. These escape stories, when they were documented, provide insights into both the security measures employed in dungeon design and the resourcefulness of human beings when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. The psychological effects of extended imprisonment in medieval dungeons were profound and lasting, often continuing to affect individuals long after their release. The experience of living in constant twilight with limited human contact and restricted movement created changes in perception, memory, and social functioning that could take months or years to resolve. Many former prisoners reported difficulty adjusting to normal light levels, challenges in relating to other people, and persistent feelings of anxiety or depression that seemed to be directly related to their time underground. These psychological impacts were rarely understood or addressed by medieval society, but they represent an important aspect of the human cost of these institutions that extends far beyond the immediate physical experience of imprisonment. The preservation and study of medieval dungeons in modern times has provided valuable insights into historical construction techniques, social structures, and daily life during this important period. Archaeological investigations have revealed details about diet, health, craftsmanship, and living conditions that supplement and sometimes contradict written historical records. The physical evidence preserved in these stone structures tells stories that their original occupants could never have imagined would be studied and analyzed centuries after their deaths. Modern visitors to preserved medieval dungeons can gain some appreciation for the physical conditions experienced by historical prisoners, though the full psychological and social impact of extended imprisonment in these facilities can only be imagined. The legacy of medieval dungeons extends far beyond their original function as places of detention. They represent important chapters in the evolution of criminal justice, social control, architectural design, and human rights. The lessons learned from studying these institutions have influenced modern approaches to imprisonment, rehabilitation, and the treatment of those who find themselves in conflict with legal and social systems.
While few would argue for a return to medieval methods of imprisonment, the study of these institutions provides valuable perspective on the ongoing challenges of balancing security, punishment, rehabilitation, and human dignity in any system designed to address criminal behavior or social conflict.
The stories of individual people who lived and died in medieval dungeons are often lost to history, but their collective experience represents an important part of the human story. These were real people with families, hopes, fears, and dreams who found themselves in circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance and adaptability. Some were there because of crimes they had committed, others because of political conflicts they had become involved in, and still others simply because they had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when powerful people needed someone to blame or punish. Their experiences remind us that the line between freedom and captivity, between security and vulnerability, between justice and oppression, has always thinner than we might like to believe. The medieval dungeon, as both a physical structure and a social institution, represents a fascinating intersection of architecture, psychology, law, politics, and human nature. These underground chambers were designed to serve specific purposes within the social and political systems of their time, but they also became laboratories for human endurance, creativity, and adaptation under extreme circumstances. The people who built them, worked in them, and lived in them were all participants in a complex social experiment that revealed fundamental truths about power, control, survival, and the resilience of the human spirit. The transformation of medieval dungeons into historical monuments and tourist attractions represents a fascinating chapter in how modern societies interpret and present their past, often sanitizing or romanticizing institutions that were sources of genuine suffering and hardship for the people who experienced them firsthand. Many preserved medieval dungeons now serve as museums, where visitors can walk through reconstructed cells, examine historical artifacts, and learn about medieval life through interpretive displays and guided tours. However, these modern presentations often struggle to convey the full reality of what life was like for people who spent months or years confined in these underground spaces, with the sounds, smells, cold, dampness, and psychological pressure that were constant features of the historical experience. The archaeological investigation of medieval dungeons has revealed details about construction techniques, daily life, and historical events that supplement and sometimes contradict the written records that have survived from the medieval period. Excavations have uncovered artifacts, including personal possessions left behind by prisoners, tools and equipment used by guards and staff, and evidence of modifications and repairs that show how these facilities evolved over time. The analysis of organic remains found in dungeon sites has provided information about diet, health, and living conditions that gives us a more complete picture of what life was really like for the people who lived and worked in these underground environments. The scientific study of medieval dungeons using modern analytical techniques has opened new avenues for understanding these historical institutions and the people who used them. Chemical analysis of stone, mortar, and metal artifacts can reveal information about construction materials, maintenance practices, and the technological capabilities of medieval builders. Anthropological studies of human remains found in dungeon sites can provide insights into the health, nutrition, and life experiences of medieval people that complement historical records. Environmental studies of dungeon sites can reveal information about past climate conditions, seasonal variations, and the ecological impact of these underground installations. The influence of medieval dungeons on literature, art, and popular culture has created images and expectations that are often quite different from historical reality, with romantic notions of noble prisoners, daring escapes, and hidden treasures that bear little resemblance to the mundane and often brutal realities of these institutions. Gothic novels, adventure stories, and modern movies have contributed to a popular mythology around dungeons that emphasizes drama, mystery, and excitement rather than the day-to-day challenges of survival, sanitation, and psychological endurance that characterized the actual historical experience. These cultural representations have influenced public perceptions and expectations about medieval dungeons in ways that can make it difficult for historians and museum professionals to present accurate and balanced interpretations of these complex institutions. The comparative study of medieval dungeons across different regions and time periods has revealed both common features and significant variations that reflect local conditions, cultural values, and technological capabilities. While the basic functions of confinement and security were universal, the specific methods used to achieve these goals varied considerably, depending on factors including available materials, climate conditions, social structures, and legal traditions. These variations provide insights into the diversity of medieval European societies and the different approaches they developed for addressing common challenges related to law enforcement, political control, and social order. The modern preservation challenges faced by medieval dungeons include structural deterioration caused by age and environmental factors, damage from tourism and public access, and the ongoing costs of maintenance and interpretation that constrain the resources of the institutions responsible for their care. Many of these underground structures were built for durability, but were not designed to accommodate large numbers of visitors or to meet modern safety and accessibility requirements. The balance between preservation and public access remains an ongoing challenge for heritage organizations and government agencies responsible for maintaining these important historical sites. As we conclude our journey through the depths of medieval dungeon life, we're left with a profound appreciation for both the ingenuity and the brutality of these remarkable institutions. They were marvels of engineering that have survived centuries of neglect and decay, yet they also represent some of humanity's darkest impulses toward control and punishment. The stories they tell are not always comfortable to hear, but they are important to understand as part of our shared human heritage. These stone chambers witnessed countless individual dramas of hope and despair, courage and fear, cruelty and compassion that played out in the shadows beneath the busy world above ground. The medieval dungeon reminds us that history is not just about kings and battles, art and literature, but also about the daily experiences of ordinary people caught up in the complex social and political forces of their time. It challenges us to think about justice, mercy, human dignity,
and the responsibilities we have toward those who are most vulnerable in our own societies.
Most importantly, it stands as a testament to the remarkable ability of human beings to endure, adapt, and maintain hope even in the most challenging circumstances imaginable.
These ancient stone walls have much to teach us if we are willing to listen to their quiet lessons about the complexity and resilience of the human experience. And as we emerge from these depths back into the light of our own time, we carry with us a deeper appreciation for both the darkness and the light that exist within human nature and human institutions. Good night.